important when we look at the gospel. A lot of times, when we look at the priesthood, a lot of times we've really reduced the priesthood to somewhat to either a gender, like a man, or to an actual role in the priesthood, like a bishop. That is a really limited, extremely limited way of looking at the power of God and the priesthood. And it's important to recognize that we are not entitled to the power of the priesthood. God grants it to us when we demonstrate that we are teaching it and living it worthily. Hi, welcome back. This is Women in Priesthood, a place for faithful LDS women, young women, and men to study priesthood power and to answer Prophet Russell M. Nelson's call to study all we can about priesthood power. This week is a pretty incredible week. We're doing Mosiah 18, and this is kind of the Doctrine and Covenants portion of the Book of Mormon. From mid-Mosiah to early Alma, you see Alma recognizing that the church is flawed, the gospel, that the priesthood that he's been kind of attending or part of is flawed and needs to be reorganized. In Mosiah 18 and on, he reorganizes the church, he reinstitutes the priesthood, the ordinances, the covenant-making process. He leads his people through that, and then they start to structure the church. And by early Alma, you see Alma and Amulek and the sons of Mosiah going out on missions. So this directly parallels a lot of these sections of the Doctrine and Covenants where you see Joseph Smith asking, what's the true church? And God answers him and says, none of them. We have to start over. We have to recreate a church that is worthy of holding his power, of God's power. Alma's story, Alma is basically he's basically the Joseph Smith of the Book of Mormon, and I can't help but wonder, it's so fascinating too, as Alma grapples with a lot of the questions that young Joseph Smith would have been struggling with as he's translating this story. What do you do when you realize that the gospel that you have discovered is not full? How do you house the power of God in a church? Where do you go from there? And he's asking all these questions. So I think one common point of clarification is that the church is a lot like a body, and that the body houses our spirit. Our body isn't our spirit, and the limitations of our spirit extend beyond our body, but our body is a safe place to kind of situate our spirit. And that's kind of how the church works, in that a worthy church can house and contain and hold the power of God and the priesthood of God. This is what Joseph Smith was kind of looking at. So you have this situation where Alma discovers, as a result of Abinadi's preaching, that the priesthood and the gospel that they have been teaching is inaccurate, right? They left out some important pieces like Jesus Christ being taught. Alma goes and starts reading the scriptures, poring over the scriptures, meditating over the scriptures. And I love the image of Joseph Smith. You know, when you think about the process of translating, a very slow process of word by word, he must have been just soaking up every word in this story of Alma, realizing that their people have lost the full gospel and what to do next. Do you start from scratch? In Alma's situation, he realizes he has to start from scratch and reorganize a way to house the gospel. So this is where we come back to the major structures of the priesthood. So we have first, the priesthood is not the church. The priesthood is the power of God. The most first and most important term is that the priesthood is the power of God. This is God's power to create the cosmos, to create life, to organize matter. And then there's the priesthood, and then there's the priesthood that he delegates to men. We organize that through the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood, and that is the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood are the power to basically govern a church. We also have what we've talked about in other classes, the patriarchal priesthood. But for now, for this class, we're really going to focus on the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood, which is the power of God to organize a church. And what Joseph Smith is reading in these, it must have been reading in these sections, especially chapter 18, is how Alma goes through this process of recognizing the truth has been lost. We need to reorganize this. We need to reestablish this people. So that's what they do. They reorganize a church, And then they facilitate, and this is one of the most important things that a church being able to have the power of the priesthood, in our case the Aaronic Melchizedek priesthood, does, is it facilitates the opportunity for individual people to make covenants. Joy D. Jones, in the recent conference talk, she talked about how she had wished that she had known sooner that she had direct access to priesthood power through covenants. That is such an important thing for us to understand. What she articulated it so beautifully, that when you covenant and you make a baptismal covenant, you are accessing direct priesthood power through the power of that covenant. In the situation of Alma, they recognize that Jesus is the Christ. They establish themselves as a church named after Christ in verse 18. And then they individually, and as a community, they individually go into the waters of Mormon and are baptized and covenant with God. So on a collective level, they receive the power of God, and individually, they re-covenant individually through Jesus Christ by recognizing that Jesus Christ is their Savior, and come back into a relationship with God as a community. It really is important that you understand that the priesthood is not the church. The church is not the same as the priesthood, and the church is not entitled to God's priesthood power. The church is a worthy container or holder of God's power as long as we are worthy, as long as the priesthood leaders are teaching what they're supposed to be, and as long as the members are living up to their covenants and living worthily of that priesthood. That's kind of the situation that you have with Joseph Smith, is that there were lots of churches, but as he discovered, and what's so interesting too, is that his initial question is actually, what church do I join? That was his initial question, is which church do I join? Which church contains the truth? And God's answer to him is none of them. We have to start from scratch. None of these churches have demonstrated a worthiness to contain the power of God, the priesthood of God. So it's important to understand that the priesthood is not a gender. And it's also not a church. It's not an organization. So that's important, because when we look at the Aaronic and the Melchizedek priesthood, the church, those are the priesthood, right? That's the priesthood that's been restored to facilitate the government and the organization of the church. And that's really clarified in verses 17, 18, and 19 in Mosiah 18. But the church is only allowed God's power when the leaders of the church function worthily and when we are actually teaching the true gospel. We're not something we're entitled to. And so that's very important when we look at the gospel. A lot of times when we look at the priesthood, a lot of times we've really reduced the priesthood to either a gender, like a man, or to an actual role in the priesthood, like a bishop or a stake president, when that is a really limited, extremely limited way of looking at the power of God and the priesthood. And it's important to recognize that we are not entitled to the power of the priesthood. God grants it to us when we demonstrate that we are teaching it and living it. In 1 Nephi, your belonging was based on kind of an ethnic identity, a family covenant. And then once you get to Mosiah, and especially by the time we hit 18, Alma reorganizes the church, and the church becomes your identity and belonging in the covenant church belongs based on your desire and your heart and your willingness to believe. This section, 18 to Alma, really directly parallels Doctrine and Covenant. You see Joseph Smith asking, what's the true church? And God answers him and says, none of them. We have to start over. We have to recreate a church that is worthy of holding his power, of God's power, reorganize the church, rename it, reinstitute the sacrament, reinstitute the covenants and ordinances of baptism, lead people through those sacred promises and covenants so that they can also have access to God's power. Joseph Smith must have been reading this, and it was almost instructing him on what he would ultimately end up doing as he reorganized the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and as he reestablished the priesthood and asked about the priesthood. What is the power of God? So this is my little recap on Mosiah 18, and I